Myself, yeah. So I'm Chris Hoofnagle. I'm a teaching professor here at the law school, and you know, to keep on time, I thought I'd speak for just 1 minute about a project that I have here with my colleague from statistics called Will Fithian. We call it the Barometer. This is a one-question flash pulse survey of Berkeley Senate faculty. We copied it from MIT. I'm happy to talk about it more, but to motivate the conversation, let me show you this result from a recent barometer where 333 Senate faculty members described whether they are concerned about retaliation when they speak on campus. And the interesting finding here is this huge bump in external threat. This question was modeled on a question that was asked at MIT just a year ago. And a year ago at MIT, the big bump was student retaliation. So in just a year, we've now seen that external threats are such a big concern for faculty here at Berkeley. Let me show just one other result. We recently asked faculty whether the criticisms of higher education were legitimate or not, and whether we should take action to address them. I won't describe the results, I'll just let you see them here, and meanwhile, I will introduce our panel. We have two panelists joining us via Zoom because they couldn't travel. Names you'll recognize. Tom Ginsburg serves as the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law and leads the Comparative Constitutions Project at the University of Chicago. He was also the inaugural faculty director of the University of Chicago Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression. That organization received a $100 million anonymous gift to promote free expression at Chicago, so maybe we'll ask him about that. Professor Ginsburg is a globally recognized authority on comparative and international law, and his research spans the field of constitutional design, democratic governance, and rule of law. Also joining us by Zoom is Jonathan Friedman. He is the Cy Sims Managing Director of U.S. Free Expression Program at Penn America, where he oversees research, advocacy, and programming focused on free expression in higher education. He's a nationally recognized voice on academic freedom, dissemination trends, and educational censorship. And finally, our colleague Sean Gailmard, who's here in person. Professor Gailmard is the Herman Royer Professor of Political Economy at UC Berkeley and the Executive Director of the Berkeley Liberty Initiative. He's also chair of the system-wide Senate Committee on Academic Freedom and the author of several influential books on political economy. So let's welcome the panel, and where we're gonna start out is we're gonna do brief remarks, and we're gonna move on to some Q&A. And so, Sean, since you're here, let's start with you, and I think that our Zoom participants will show up above.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure to join you today. So our theme for this panel is Escalating Threats to Free Inquiry. Raises some additional questions, which is since when and from where are the threats arising? I think the protagonist, as Stephen said earlier, the prompt for the panel is the Trump administration's recent attacks on university autonomy. I would like to note an important point about this, in my view, which is that there's a context for these attacks and they don't come from nowhere. As we think about the Trump administration strategy, I see kind of two models that faculty use in our discussions of this. One of them is more comfortable for us. One of them is less comfortable for us. The more comfortable theory of the Trump administration's approach is that academia is a key institution of dissent in society and truth-telling and sense-making. And because Donald Trump wants to be an autocrat, he needs to destroy these institutions. We are attacked under this theory because of our virtues. In fact, given Trump's vices, the attacks are evidence of our virtues. This is a distillation of the theory, perhaps a too brief summary, but a prevalent account that I see among colleagues trying to make sense of what's happening. A less comfortable account of what's happening is that academia has already surrendered its reputation for impartiality, on which its political autonomy depends. It is a threat to Trump simply because he is on the right, and academia has chosen increasingly to join a political conflict from the left. Some will say academia deserves what it gets. I wouldn't go this far, but when we join a fight, we should expect to fight back. Relevant to adjudicating between these theories is that exactly as American political parties have increased to historically unforeseen levels of polarization, academia has tracked increasingly towards just one of these parties. As the parties pull further apart, academia drifts further towards one camp. As evidence of this, as I would cite well-known evidence on the political leanings of faculty, which have always been further left than American society, but very much increasingly so and dramatically in recent years. Is this a coincidence? Is it a result of, as I've actually heard colleagues say sometimes, only I think half in jest, that reality has a left-wing bias? Or is it a product of self-reinforcing ideological consensus among the highly educated? There's probably some of both, but we can't look at major scholarly literatures that happen to support progressive causes, despite very weak empirical evidence. The overuse, for example, of the concept of stereotype threat to delegitimize all use of standardized testing, or health equity research on the racial concordance of physicians and infant mortality. We can't look at selective demands for rigor that we encounter across social science that is correlated with the ideology of the speaker and seriously defend the claim that all of the prevalence we see from the ideological left in academia is simply because we find truths that are uncomfortable for the right. So my second point that I'd like to make very briefly is then how do we move forward from here? That's our context, and those are our competing theories of what's happening. How do we move forward? Moving forward requires understanding an objective, which is, as I understand it, a shared one is university autonomy. It's probably not a coincidence that university autonomy at the American university developed during the longest period of low polarization among political parties in American history. That was decades of unprecedentedly low polarization in the post-war era. Securing our autonomy going forward will involve short-term and long-term strategies. We hear a lot about the short-term strategies of legal resistance, Harvard's lawsuit against the Trump administration, mass mobilization that we see across campuses. But there's a long-term question I'd like us to think about as well, which stems from the fact that the university cannot be autonomous of the government if it is hostile to the party that holds the reins of power half the time. That is true whether we win the short-run legal fights or we lose them. If you take significant shares of your funding from the government, you are the government's agent. You can expect them to try to assert control over what you do. Retreating to the procedural defense of academic freedom, it's all okay because we are letting scholars be scholars, as we always have, will not convince anyone who's not already on our side. In my view, we will secure the autonomy of the university by reclaiming a reputation for free and open inquiry, regardless of the partisan political implications. We should do this not because the Trump administration is banging on the door, but because it is our core value, it is our self-concept, and it is the source of good we do in society. To reclaim that spirit, that culture of open inquiry, regardless of political implications, requires policies from the administration. It requires norms from us as faculty, but none of this will be enough. It also requires a new pipeline of scholars who select out or are forced out of higher education today. We need to open that pool of scholars to change the set of ideas that are represented within our institution. When that happens, we will have a natural embrace of open inquiry, not because the administration demands it by policy, but because it's what we actually want to do. Thanks. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sean. We're next going to go to Tom, who joins us by Zoom.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. As someone with 3 degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, I'm a big fan, and there as often as I can be. Yes, I want to echo a couple of points Sean made, but then make some different ones. So as I think about challenges to academic freedom in general, I think of them as coming in 3 buckets. First of all, there's the state, and that is, of course, the one that we are talking about today. And as he suggested, this challenge doesn't come from nowhere. It is being done because it's a popular thing. In our anti-elitist populist era, no softer target than particularly the Ivy League universities. I just saw some polling on this, and it's very interesting. The American public is rather confused in some sense. They like their own university. They like university medical centers. They like life-saving research. They hate the elite private universities. And there's a paradoxical thing where they say that they really like research universities, but they don't like the elite ones. So it's sounding in populism. We've done something that has made us vulnerable to this, and there's a story that needs to be told to fix that. In any case, that's what the origin of the state challenge. Second challenge, the traditional one, is from donors. And, I'm at the University of Chicago. I think we do an excellent job. We return gifts all the time if there's too many strings attached. But, many have been concerned about that threat. And then the third threat is the one that's actually been latent for the last couple of decades or decade and a half, which is a threat from within. And this is the threat to free inquiry that's caused by groupthink, by shutting down speakers, by shutting down lines of research that don't fit a particular orthodoxy. And it has led to a lack of trust. And there are other things that have led to a lack of trust, replication crises and such. So we haven't done a good job self-policing and doing the hard work of constructing an environment for free inquiry and expression. We need to return to that. So I agree with all that. Now, in terms of the challenge, this panel's on the challenge from the right. We all know about the state and we've followed the dynamics. I think there are a couple of things that we ought to do and we ought to recognize. One thing we ought to do is be very clear about the red lines. And that is, of course, academic freedom. I think if the administration was to come to my university and say, you're going to lose all your federal funding unless you close this department or fire this professor, we would have to return the federal money. I note that at the start of the compact, as it's called, between universities and the federal government, it really dates to World War II, our president, Robert Maynard Hutchins, said, we should reject this compact. We shouldn't take the federal money because it will eventually come with political strings and that threatens our autonomy. And it's been an amazing compact. It's produced the greatest research university system in the history of the world. But we're now at the point where the other shoe has fallen, as they say. And so maybe Hutchins was right about that a little bit. We do have to draw the red lines. We have to embark on a very rigorous program of internal reform and construction of environments in which people can challenge each other without being, kicked out of the discipline and such. Partly it lies at the level of the discipline and the department, which have become in some cases vehicles for imposing orthodoxy, or even worse, particularly in the University of California system, adopting their own individual foreign policies, which just obviously undermines inquiry freedom because it says that there's a right view and a wrong view on some question that's outside the scope of the discipline. There's no place for that in academia, and that we've let it happen is on us. We have to fix that part of it too. The other thing which is emerging, and I don't think I've seen it discussed much in the public sphere, is the social base of what's going on. We have, for example, students who will now activists from the right. Just as we had an activist cancel culture from the left, now we have activists from the right professors recording what other students to try to out them and gain some advantage in the particular media ecosystem in which they operate. And that is a very severe threat because when you ask faculty, students, everyone is the number one fear, the number one thing preventing us from pursuing knowledge vigorously and engaging in free expression is fear of each other, particularly fear of the students and the social media. So we just need some rules about that. There's no problem with that. We can, in my state, you can't record people without their permission. We just need to enforce those rules. And we need to experiment with things like Chatham House rules, which I know some schools are doing, to say, basically, look, this is a sacred space where we're going to talk about ideas and people are going to try out ideas, and that's okay. You're not going to out them later for having said something in class. It's a cooperative environment, a cooperative discussion. But we are facing a challenge from those who are not committed to inquiry. And I don't particularly blame them. The media ecosystem is encouraging those folks to come in and undermine our processes. But I think we have to always be thinking about policies that will advance meaningful conversations about tough issues rather than imposing orthodoxy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. And I believe we now have Jonathan Friedman on Zoom as well. Okay, there you are. Great. Welcome. And we're doing brief remarks, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Great. Well, I'm sorry that we had some Zoom complications, but I'm thrilled to be here. And I'll just speak for a few minutes, and then looking forward to some questions, so Q&A. At PEN America, we have been tracking since 2021 the rise of what we started then to call educational gag orders. These were bills that were based on a premise that emerged really, in the kind of right-wing think tank circles to suggest that the government should threaten to defund educational institutions more or less in whatever means possible if those institutions were either not upholding free speech or not doing a sufficient job facilitating intellectual diversity, or in K-12 schools, teaching about race and DEI in ways that certain politicians didn't like federally. Now, it's important to note that this isn't the first time that we have seen a rise of legislators and politicians generally positioning themselves as wanting to dictate from on high how people in educational institutions speak with one another, ask questions, probe areas of knowledge, or really teach about things like history. And in that sense, there is a great parallel between what we are seeing today that started a number of years ago and periods of American history, like, for example, when teaching Darwin and evolution was outlawed in a number of states, or during the McCarthy era when there were, literal witch hunts into, the affiliations of faculty and what they were teaching. So there are a lot of echoes, but truly what we are seeing today is unprecedented, if just in the mere fact of the scale and scope of what is unfolding. And what started as a sort of kernel of a notion that legislators at different levels, whether a mayor or a city council or a school board, or higher than that, a state board of education, a governor, state legislature, and now federally, the notion that those political entities should set themselves up to impose these restraints on educational institutions has essentially birthed, what must be understood as some of the most creative but also pernicious legislation in terms of protecting freedom of speech. And, I'm going to just put aside K-12 and really focus on higher ed here. What started then in terms of laws that started emerging a number of years ago, at first they seemed obviously unconstitutional, trying to tell faculty what it was that they could or couldn't teach, trying to cabin what we might think of as training at universities, but also with a heavy emphasis on not being very specific about what counts as training, what counts as teaching, what counts as curriculum, what counts as educational programs. There's been a sort of deliberate effort to continue to blur that line, and that continues. So years later, now after a period of time in which we saw fewer and fewer laws of that nature, we saw other kinds of efforts emerge to police, to exert new control over higher education, particularly at the state level. That over the past few years has included, for example, laws to punish faculty, mechanisms to complain about faculty if they don't represent enough intellectual diversity in their classroom, laws to police accreditation agencies, laws to demand that faculty post all of their syllabi publicly, largely so that people who want to complain about it have a way to do so, to scrutinize it. Each of these kinds of laws, has emerged similarly from this idea that is at its core about trying to impose new controls on the autonomy of universities. And many politicians who are behind this will often say one thing, maybe in a tweet or when they're asked about this and they're speaking off the cuff, and they'll say another, when they are more sensitive to a potential legal challenge. So, for example, I remember years ago, the governor of Alabama insisting that her bill wasn't going to penalize teaching, and then simultaneously sort of cheering, the banning of teaching about CRT in that state. And so there's a lot of double speak. There's a lot of effort to really try and pass the most vague versions of these. And now what's happened under the Trump administration in 2025 are two phenomenon. And people are paying attention to one, but I think not the other. One is just the total porting over and continuing evolution of this language and of these proposals, which I think would have probably happened anyways, even without the federal government getting involved. That is to say, there has been a progression. Anybody paying attention will tell you, well, there was divisive concepts, then it was CRT, sometimes it's DEI, or other times it's gender ideology. A lot of these laws have a set of different terms that they have adopted to try and, say what ought not to be permitted. And again, most of them are sort of oriented toward being as vague, intimidating, and menacing as possible, because when you have vague laws, obviously people are going to take a wide berth, as we are seeing happen in many university campuses. But the second phenomenon, especially in 2025, is that we've actually seen a return to some of the most vague and pernicious forms of this legislation in a few states. So many people have not caught that Mississippi and Wyoming, for example, have both passed new laws this year that return to some of the earlier hallmarks of this legislation of a few years ago, in that it's legislation that just in a blanket way applies to public institutions or K-12 and college without K-12 and higher ed, without distinguishing between the two. And so, although we haven't seen that exactly at the federal level, certainly some of the some of the executive orders, are getting at that. They're hinting at that. On top of this, we also have seen not only obviously the efforts by the federal government to try to use whatever mechanisms are available to it, for example, through OCR and through threats to Harvard and Columbia. We've seen them also try and police, what is acceptable as an academic department, what in the letter to Harvard, there's an emphasis on viewpoint diversity and, having the federal government tell Harvard how it ought to set up governance of students and faculty inside the university. And that's incredibly unprecedented. So we've seen this sort of just flourishing of a lot of different kinds of creative ideas. I think what's important for people who lead universities to understand is that the vast majority of this is unconstitutional, is obviously an effort to control what we speak, read, think, share. You don't have to be doing something as blatant as banning a whole bunch of books from the U.S. Naval Academy to recognize that there is this effort that has been growing momentum from it from the federal government. But what we also have to be alert to is a new mandate around patriotic education, which suggests that any institution, library, museum, school, university that receives public funds, will have new diktats placed on it in terms of how it approaches the topics of American history and what kinds of attitudes it will allow to be promoted. And when we think about, the university and what it is supposed to represent, that's clearly at odds with one another. I think also we have to recognize and look inwardly and say that the best response to this moment, of course, there's going to be legal challenges. Of course, there's going to be efforts to, fight against what is clearly a wave of censorship from the government. But there is also a degree of soul searching and practical necessity that I think isn't addressed enough in higher ed. And this has been something that we at Penn America have done a lot of work on for many years, trying to work with stakeholders, campus leaders, faculty to improve the climate for free speech. Because while I do think some of the stories and anecdotes have been weaponized, in particular, something like viewpoint diversity, which is something that is laudable and should be promoted on higher ed, takes on a different meaning when it is weaponized into law and people are punished for it, because you can make that mean whatever you want. There's no way for someone to represent all viewpoints in all moments. And so it opens any of us who do work in academia to criticism, discipline, punishment, whatever. So I do think there is a degree of effort that can and ought to be made, just echoing Tom, to figure out how to do this better, to figure out, and I don't mean get us back to some fake glorious past where truly everyone on campuses always had the same level or attitude toward free speech. I don't think it existed, but I at the same time retain a kind of aspirational hope that it is possible to educate students incoming about freedom of speech, possible to help faculty better mediate disputes, possible to help administrators better understand why it undermines free speech for everyone when you decide on the fly to cancel a speaker or override other people's speech rights. So that's the work that Penn America is doing, both trying to track and stand up to this moment, but also retain our focus on practical educational solutions that help people on campuses on the front lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I want to reflect an observation you made off both Tom and Sean, and that's the idea that some of the attacks, some of the external attacks clearly are unconstitutional. Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but even my rough understanding leads me to that belief. And so I want to turn to Tom first and then Sean, and it's partly a legal and partly a political question. And the legal question to Tom is, which of these attacks truly are dangerous? Which are likely to gain ground in the courts and perhaps could threaten the university in its current form? And conversely, which defenses should we most invest in? So what should our affirmative agenda be for protecting the university? And then to Sean, I'd like you to comment on the political nature of the approach. Is this flood the zone, or is there some other strategy here? Tom, how about you start?
Sure. As John said, many of these things are patently illegal, but they're sort of law-ish, if I can say. So let's take the Title VI, cutoffs of funds. That's been absolutely weaponizing Title VI on the basis of either anti-white discrimination or anti-Semitism. And it's true that in severe cases of that, the government, one of the remedies is that they can cut off funds. The Trump administration, sort of like the art of the deal, went straight to maximum sanction without following any of the process. And there's just no way that's going to survive in court. It's also seems to be First Amendment violations in terms of discrimination on viewpoint and things like this. So I don't think any of those things are going to survive. And then there's many other realms where we see similar things, the attacks that it deals with law firms and such. I find it existential, though, and I was just meeting with a few university presidents yesterday, and they find it existential because the money's been cut off. It takes a while to get an injunction to force the federal government to turn on the spigot again, and that's leading immediately to hundreds of job losses and things like this. And ultimately, if you talk about weaponizing NIH funds, that's pretty existential for a lot of universities, any university with a big hospital. As Princeton spoke out against this and appeared to be very brave, but Princeton, of course, has no hospital, and they're extremely wealthy. For many others, the only viable strategy is to try to comply and work some kind of deal. What should we do? Well, that's a big question. I mean, I do think that we have to recognize that at least some of these demands are not totally insane. The Columbia, which is widely seen as having, just capitulated completely. But of course, some of the things they were demanding were probably things Columbia wanted to do anyway. I don't see any reason why people should be allowed to walk around campus with masks to hide their identity. We need to know, if you want to protest, great, but you have to own up to the fact that you're protesting. And the disciplinary system at Columbia, as I understand it, was quite broken. And so, there's lots of those reforms we should have been doing and we should do now. And every other university should, figure out what does it take before the government comes knocking. But at the end of the day, having given in to some government demands, as has been said very often, they're just going to keep coming and there's no peace to be bought. And that's why many people are very happy that Harvard, which received much more invasive set of demands, did decide to sue. They're in a position to do so. And there's no way any university could have given in to the demands that were made of Harvard, which was basically a government takeover of departments. So I was glad to see that, and we need to support them and hope that they win that suit.
Let me press you there, Tom, a little bit. What do you think was underneath the Trump administration's strategy to give Harvard a demand that it could not meet and would have to be responded with litigation?
It's interesting. I mean, there was some suggestion that the Trump administration said, like, "Oh, we didn't mean to send that letter," as a draft, which was a way. But they didn't stop they didn't withdraw it. They just said it was a mistake. So I think probably this was an opening bid in a negotiation or something like that, and they were going to. And so I don't know that with anything the administration is doing that it's all well thought out strategy. It's it's simply let's break some. It's an Elon Musk kind of approach. Let's break some stuff and see what sticks. And when we get pushback, we'll back off. And that is what's happening in some cases. And so I don't know that they thought that set of demands would have triggered litigation. It certainly did. And now, hey, great. From their point of view, that's these elite private East Coast universities resisting you, the people. I think it's a political winner, but I don't think they necessarily planned that to work out this way.
Sean, how do you see this?
With the recent actions of the government, it seems clearly a divide and conquer strategy approaching the university. But we see in the broader scope an asymmetry of tactics of control between left and right, but not an asymmetry of objectives of control. They use different tactics because left and right have different relationships with the university. The right is attempting to assert control from outside of it. Part of the reason for that is because of how the left has taken a strategy of asserting control from inside of it. But that's the context that we're seeing here is no political partisan side has an embrace of a free inquiry with nonpartisan objectives. We have here this just incredibly tempting target for any political project is this institution in society that disseminates knowledge. We said so. It's right in our mission. Okay, so it's to find and disseminate knowledge. If you can harness that to your political project, it's incredibly powerful. Every political partisan side wants to do that. They just have an asymmetry of the tactics of doing it. The reason why we have the meat cleaver, flamethrower approach from the right is because of the success of tactics used over a long period of time from the inside by the left. So it creates kind of a Hail Mary or kind of a position of desperation that the right is left to push from. And leads to kind of a sometimes chaotic result, and one that will actually be destructive of good things that the university does. When we academics push back on these things, we say, look at all these good things you're attacking. Yes, if they said to us, listen, give us the good things and take away the bad things, we would not give them an accurate list. They know it. And so that's why we're in the position we're in with a fairly chaotic politics.
Let me pick up on one issue that Tom mentioned, and that's mass. Sean, could you speak to this and this issue on the Berkeley campus? We recently had a debate on this surrounding our resolution.
On the mass side?
On the mask, ought we to take a step such as requiring no masks?
Oh, masks, yes. Okay, yeah, masking. Yeah, so the California Assembly also imposed requirements as part of AB 8, which the University of California has been discussing for the entire academic year, which are almost identical to the mandates that the Trump administration has begun discussing, which is no masking for the purpose of concealing your identity. That's what they say. They specifically say for that purpose. If you need to wear a mask for some, for personal health reasons or something like that, it's explicitly, ruled out of the statement in the policy. Obviously, there's a problem of assessing what was the intention of a person wearing a mask. But I will simply note that that's not a right-coded or a right-wing approach. That's one that our own California Assembly gave to us as well. So if the campus law enforcement takes a wide berth in acknowledging there are many reasons why people might wear a mask, and the burden on them is high to show that it is for the purpose of concealing identity, then that's a return to a pre-COVID culture that seems to be widely shared.
I'm going to turn to audience Q&A in just a second. So raise your hand if you have a question, but let me ask one last question to all three of you. Sean, I'd like you to start, and then we'll go to Jonathan. And it's picking back up on the recommendations of how to move forward. You recommended that we need to think more about heterodoxy in hiring, but every time I think about that, I can only see a kind of mirror image where we're now assessing people's political beliefs. How do we bring about more heterodoxy without engaging in some of the practices that we have labeled as problematic today?
One thing I've learned from colleagues on discussion of this issue is that there aren't really non-political beliefs about what the university should be doing. Every faculty line priority is in some sense political, and that's not necessarily bad. But there are definitely nonpartisan ways to discuss opening our pipeline of scholars, the kinds of topics that we ask people to talk about. Can we have we have searches, faculty searches designed to study the position of different identity groups in society? Can we have faculty searches similarly dedicated to studying the role of markets in promoting human flourishing? Is there political content to this? There certainly is. Is it requiring a DEI statement for conservatives? It seems a little different from that. So I think there's some space there, but the key is to find an intellectual content that takes us in the direction we want to go forward, and to focus on that, rather than simply saying we want to save space for Republicans.
Jonathan, I'll ask you to go next, but I want to change the inflection a little bit. You've written about what's happened in the States, and I'd really like to hear your assessment of the different civic virtues curricula that have popped up. Are these realistic ways of creating heterodoxy, or will they be interfered with as well by state legislatures?
What a great question. I was thinking about that a minute ago. That has been something that we have seen a number of state legislators propose, a center for, intellectuals. Sometimes they have free speech or diverse intellectualism or whatever, intellectual diversity, whatever they want to call it. Most of the time, these things are being foisted upon universities or sometimes funded by external entities. And in almost every instance that I've seen, the result ultimately, even of more right-leaning faculty who might want to be part of these, is that they come to discover that these entities are not playing by the same rules as others on campuses. They kind of have decided they're not going to participate in regular processes for evaluating or determining academic courses, or how they're going to appoint faculty or whatever, because ultimately it is, all of this a move away from basically putting more power in the hands of faculty to determine the directions of our teaching. I really want to stress that there is absolutely no monopoly on trying to pass laws that impose new rules that constrict how faculty speak to the right. We have seen something similar in the left, even in California a few years ago with the California Community College Standards, which I believe were subsequently shot down because they were trying to impose sort of the diversity, equity teaching requirements on faculty as part of how they could be evaluated for promotion and tenure. But I also think it's really important that we recognize too, and for me, this is always what's so fascinating about all of this that I've encountered the term heterodox twice in two very different political moments. And we're familiar with today. Heterodox academy, the notion of heterodoxy gets accused as being a lot of times cover for other kinds of things that are being now pushed by more extreme legislators or by the right in general, an effort to retake over the university. Turn back the clock 100 years ago and look up a social club in New York City called Heterodoxy. And what you will find is a group of radical, left, progressive women, LGBTQ before it was called that, who were getting together under the general banner across racial lines in the Greenwich Village to have debates and conversations representative of what we might generally call diversity or intellectual variety, or however we want to call it. We have to recognize, I think today, all of this has become so politicized, but actually the vast majority of us are, I think really intrigued and supportive of the idea of a university that allows for, as Tom, you were saying, pushback as part of a regular routine part of their operations. How do we do that with searches? I absolutely agree with you, Sean, that we need more thought about this. We need to think about diversity of thought as a virtue when we are constructing searches and departments. I think it also is part of the constriction of full-time academic roles. So when there's fewer roles, it's a lot harder to do this. And I think we have to also just give some grace to the fact that nobody wants to work with people they can't get along with. That's just human nature. Who wants to work in an academic department where they hate the person on the left and they hate the person on the right? Those are strong terms I'm offering, but I think that plays a role in this. And so thinking about what could help, inoculate us from that tendency, whether it's searches that, we already do have some mechanisms for this in terms of how searches usually try to involve faculty from, different specializations, et cetera. But I think the worst thing that we can do is continue to seed the ground on this to legislators who seem to want to define diversity of thought, heterodoxy, intellectual variation, however we want to get to it, in extremely partisan ways, because I think that is heavily problematic. The vast majority of academic issues aren't right-left. They don't have yes-no answers. They are complicated, and we need to make sure that we are ensuring the space to inquire into them that way.
Thank you, Jonathan. If I can change the inflection a little bit more for Tom, Jonathan just warned of the external forms of external threat of reform. We do have an internal force. That's the American Association of University Professors. This question is a little unfair to our earlier panelist, Brian Sozek, but I do want to pose it to you, Tom, of what you think the AAUP should be doing on these issues.
Yes, well, it's interesting you asked that. I don't know if you've seen that I have a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education that was entitled by them, Can Academic Freedom Survive the AAUP? And I was really talking about Committee A, which Brian is on, and he knows very well that I think has gone off the rails, that they're no longer defending academic freedom as traditionally understood. But I won't raise that set of debates here. I will say that the AAUP itself is in fact very important. They just won a very important lawsuit the other day, and they're going to continue to be a force for pushing back. And in some contexts, faculty unions can be very important as well. So I do think they're a vehicle for collective action. When the university won't speak up about issues like immigration, revocations of visas of our students, the AAUP is doing that, and that's extremely important because you can't have a university environment in which full First Amendment rights only apply to American citizens. That's a disaster. So I'm actually quite supportive of some of the things the AAUP is doing, and but they need to get back on the page of what academic freedom is. They've gone off the rails there. I do think in terms of this general problem, there's a kind of ethos, and it's almost like a professional ethics. And maybe the AAUP could do this. I don't think maybe in their current configuration they're going to be able to. But professional ethics are what, in my study of comparative authoritarianism, which is what I work on, is often a very critical locus of survival and institutional resilience. Professional ethics are really important in academia. One of our demands of our roles is to have some epistemic humility. We don't know what we don't know. And we should always remember that. And by the way, it's a very easy time to talk about that because everyone in the room has been through COVID and remembers like washing your milk carton so you wouldn't get COVID. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have done that, but the point is we were deeply uncertain, and so we engaged in this behavior, which we now know did absolutely nothing. And COVID was also an instance in which some academics, including the current chair of the National Institutes of Health, Jay Bhattacharya, were sanctioned and sidelined because of their unorthodox views. We should use that example to remind people, hey, we don't know everything, and we should actively celebrate in the academy. And there's lots of things one could do here. My university president thinks we should incentivize replication of studies. We should perturb our data, if you will, which is a term used in theoretical physics, by bringing in people we know disagree with things to steel man the arguments and such. There's many things we can do if we adopt that as a central element to the mission. That's one thing we're trying to do at this forum on free expression that I'm running here at Chicago. But we have to remember that that's what's important. One of the barriers is capture of the committee that's Brian's on, I'm going to be quite honest, capture of the Committee A, and capture of disciplines and departments by people who are not committed to this ethos of inquiry. And that's something we have to call out, and I don't think the rest of us can survive capture of disciplines by people who are not committed to free inquiry.
Thank you, Tom, and I will admit that I'm captured by the clock. And I see that we only have 4 minutes left, and then we need our well-deserved break. So let's turn to Q&A, and I have to ask, it must only be a one-part question.
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Melanie Zeman. I'm from the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. My question is, this group has talked about how some of the threats are explicitly illegal, and we know that our court system moves very slowly, and there is a lag time. What does this group think can be done about some of the fear and some of the chilling effect on speech that might be occurring in that lag time from some of the actions that have been taken by the Trump administration?
My mic is off. I'll just say that's an enormous concern, and that's why I think it's really important for universities to speak out right away, to do everything they can to protect the environment. The chilling effect on the students, the foreign nationals, the green card holders, etc., it's already enormous. Talk to anyone in that status, and it's a death blow to inquiry. So the chilling effect is what we always worry about in free speech law and discussion, and I think it's clearly here, and we have an obligation to do everything we can. But let's face it, it's going to be very hard, precisely because the courts move very slowly.
So our law faculty are captured by law firms, and they're going to say, hire all those law firms as fast as you can and litigate. Let's go to our next question, our next question, so that we can have one more question before our break.
Okay. So my name is Deborah Blocker. I'm a professor in French and Italian studies, and I thank you very much for an extremely enlightening panel. I also want to ask a kind of far-reaching, forward-looking question, which is the following. So in a situation where, as one of the panelists said, I can't remember, the only time that we had low polarization in this country was during the 50s, and that's also the moment where social inequalities were at the lowest, right? Right now, we are at a moment, as Thomas Piketty has very well shown, where the social inequalities are at the highest, right? And so we have polarization, and we have problems of free speech, right? Because when we had low polarization, it was easy to have free speech, but now we have high polarization, and it's hard to have free speech. So my question is, how do we get out of this kind of catch-22 circle, right? Is there a way that free speech and freedom of inquiry can get us back to a place where we have more social equality and less social inequality, economic inequality? So I'm thinking of not essentially thinking of social equality as bringing about a time where we can speak freely, but rather thinking of academic freedom and freedom of speech in universities as bringing about a time where we can have less social inequality. I know this sounds kind of fanciful, but I wanted to hear.
Not at all. It's an eloquent question. Let's hand it to our political scientist.
Sure. I don't know if robust free speech and free inquiry will reduce socioeconomic inequality, but let's give it a try, right? It certainly can't hurt, but I think actually the deeper issue is we have to accept at the university that there are certain things in society that we're actually downstream of. We cannot change them. Okay, so as we think of the university as the factory for the reform of social justice or social relations, there are parts of it that are downstream, that are upstream of us that we cannot affect. We must be in a position, if we love the university, we want it to thrive, we must be in a position to thrive in that world which we cannot change. So if we are adapted to, if we have modes of discussion adapted to worlds of low socioeconomic inequality, now we live in a different world, we pose ourselves danger. If we attach ourselves, are hostile to one political party and attach ourselves more and more explicitly to another one, that creates a danger for us that we're not in a position to be able to fix. Okay, so does the spirit of open inquiry push us in the right direction? I think it does. How much will it move the needle? I don't know, but we should try.
If I can just close by saying, I think we can all feel good about this as members of the University of California, which has a fantastic record of promoting social mobility, among the best institutions in the country and lifting people out of poverty. This is a story we need to continue to tell and be proud of. Let's thank our panelists, Tom, Sean, and Jonathan. Thank you for your time today. And we now... We now have a 15-minute break, well-deserved break. See you at 11:15. I guess I just waved. I don't know how else to connect.